Fantasy, like, as a genre, is pretty inherently based on Tolkien's work. Elves' immortal lifespans, dwarves being industrial, orcs being stupid cockney warriors, all of that is from Lord of the Rings. I think copying these into your setting isn't necessarily a bad idea, as it's what everyone is familiar with, but I do find them to be very, very boring, and can pretty easily lead to creative pitfalls. Quick self-promotion. I have a Discord now. Come visit, invite all of your friends, and then pay me money. Now, you might reasonably ask what credentials I could possibly have to discuss this topic with such confidence. And with that out of the way, let's begin. If you do intend on playing in generic Fantasyland, good luck roleplaying the 1,000-year-old elf who has no doubt taken dozens of partners in their life, and seen the deaths of uncountable people. Their experiences are so radically different from anything humans are even capable of experiencing that it becomes literally impossible to relate to them on any level. Imagine trying to talk to someone now who participated in the Third Crusade. Now, that can be okay, but I think it only really works in the context of someone who is very different from others, like a reclusive wizard or something. A 500-year-old is just going to be so fundamentally different from a 30-year-old human that their interactions are not going to be normal. How do you fix this? Well, hear me out. Delete all differences between races. All of them. That might seem dramatic, but it's also fairly realistic. Humans are very, very unique people in that we can basically be every alignment imaginable and are very flexible. Except, that shouldn't be limited to humans. It makes no sense for it to be. Any sentient civilization should be identical in this respect. People are inherently individuals, and unless all people in a race are under the exact same culture and banner, which, good luck with that, by the way, will all be very different from one another if they're not a hive mind. Even physical differences mean very little because, get this, humans are capable of living in Antarctic shitholes equally as well as the Sahara. Dwarves shouldn't all live in the mountains unless they have a genetic reason for doing so. All races should intermingle and coexist. That's literally just how people work. If you're, say, Wizards of the Coast, and say that canonically all orcs are really strong but stupid, that's not cool world building, that is literally textbook racism. Orcs shouldn't be genetically bound to be dumb bodybuilders, that makes no sense. All people are individuals, and their race wouldn't dictate anything about their interests or aptitudes. Their culture might, but believe it or not everyone from a certain race is going to be under the same culture. It's for this reason that I'd recommend building nations around cultures rather than races.
If we're all clones, why am I the only one with a sense of humor?
For a nation to be so significantly racially segregated that's called something like the Dwarf Kingdoms, there has to be a reason. Maybe they're racist, maybe the dwarves eat rocks and no one else does, just something. If the human kingdoms look like generic Fantasyland, there's no reason they wouldn't have orcs, elves, dwarves, lizardmen, and whatever else in their borders. A country is not going to go out of its way to push away potential traders, taxpayers, and citizens unless they are literally evil. D&D's default rules for language are also kind of baffling. They are also racially segregated for some reason, which makes negative sense. Naming languages after races makes no sense, because languages develop alongside cultures, which, as previously mentioned, can be made up of any variety of people. The only way this could potentially make sense is if these languages possess sounds that only one race is capable of pronouncing, like if elven vocal cords were capable of pronouncing sounds dwarves could not. For D&D, I would recommend renaming Common, which is basically English, to whatever the most dominant power is in your setting. Different languages are just the languages of different countries, as is how it works in real life. This may reveal my own biases, but I would also heavily recommend not making a high fantasy setting if you want it to remain grounded and believable. Especially if you're going for the kinda generic, muddy medieval Europe but with magic vibe. Here is why. The mages in your kingdom have come up with a way to magically produce water at no cost. This is fantastic! Them being able to do this completely changes how agriculture infrastructure now works in this country at a fundamental level, which has knock-on effects to literally every other aspect of the world. Infinite water means irrigated crops, which means effectively infinite food, which means a massive population explosion, which means technology advancing faster, and, well, you get the idea. You just straight up can't have muddy medieval Europe where everyone is miserable if old Grandpa Jenkins can make infinite food in his backyard. Practically all conflicts in all of history have been over acquisition of resources, and when one or more of those has been made effectively infinite via magic, that changes everything. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when you're thinking about plausible conflicts to have in your setting, you have to factor these in. Maybe a smaller nation has just stolen the secrets to water miracles and that's given them a massive edge over their neighbors, you know, something like that. If you just want to romp around in the wilderness with your buds and just kill some dragons, I don't know, low fantasy is probably the way to go, because otherwise your world's going to be completely unbelievable unless you spent a lot of time thinking about it. This is admittedly very subjective, but I also just find magic to be incredibly boring. Talion here will help me explain why. Melee wounds are a lot more interesting than magic ones. Humans have around 20 different unique body parts to target, and that's not even counting the head, which is its own can of worms. There are so many different ways to YouTube different parts of the body, and so many stances to do so in, like giving people the Birmingham Special. The amount of descriptions you can give are so vivid and interesting, and they can change drastically if you're fighting an enemy with a drastically different bone structure than a human, like a dragon. With magic, on the other hand, Celerha pulls her hand back into a fist, balling up magic in her hand, and then releases it in front of her. The fireball bursts onto her foe, searing their flesh. Sounds badass, right? But that's it. That's the only description to give. You will change pretty much nothing about this, regardless of enemy type, or race, or armor, or anything, really. There is infinitely less room for creativity because they all boil down to, I channel magic, and then I release it, and then there's an explosion. I will admit that this approach can have its pitfalls, assuming you're writing for a TTRPG game like D&D or Pathfinder. If you're focusing more on creative writing, then the following doesn't really apply. A lot of systems are heavily based around magic as a core concept. D&D, for example, has 8 different schools of magic and hundreds of spells. The balance of spellcasters is definitely questionable, like how they get access to interplanetary teleport, but it's pretty hard to ignore that magic is a huge part of the rules. Limiting access to magic in your setting might be seen as massively limiting, but I disagree. The most obvious benefit is that when magic actually shows up, it'll be significantly more impactful if it's rare. Obi-Wan whipping out that Force mind trick in A New Hope was especially cool because he's just some disheveled old guy in Death Valley for the first hour of the movie. And if players want to use magic, you don't have to limit them. They can be literally anyone in your setting. You can come up for a reason for them to be a spellcaster. And lastly, this is specific to D&D and Pathfinder, the balance between spellcasters and martials is totally out of whack. I'll spare you the balancing rant and will just say that mages get access to guaranteed damage which should never ever exist, especially in enormous AoE flavor. Maybe I'll go into more detail in the second channel, but everyone in your party being martials is a lot better for not only balancing, but also for grounding them as people and not gods. Speaking of gods, let's segue to talking about plot hooks and enemies. This is my own personal take, but fighting sentient people will always be more engaging than fighting monsters in the woods. Fighting people is easy to make personal and deep because they're people. Individuals are complex and interesting and can be given a lot of different motivations and dogmas. Animals always boil down to, I want to eat. Unless they're serving a higher power, and in such cases the fight should be framed like the higher entity is the enemy and not their pawn. When you're making a combat encounter with a person, their beliefs can be all over the place, from religious zealot to freedom fighter to random guard to noble soldier to a slaver. People have infinite reasons for wanting to have beef with others, including the party. Unless you tie them to like a hive mind with higher goals or something, lower intelligence creatures almost always lack this kind of depth, and are there mostly just for their next meal or to save their family. Here are 2 examples with a similar outcome to prove this point. Stalking through the woods, you see a robot patrolling through the forest. You walk forward, eagerly anticipating putting a bullet through its visor, before you step on a bear trap. Yelping out in pain, the robot spots you, firing buckshot at you. While you try to worm your way out of the trap and free your leg, it finishes you off, laughing at your stupidity. Alternatively, running through the woods, you come across a bear. It one-shots you and eats your corpse. The adversaries you include in your stories are always going to be the most impactful and memorable characters you introduce. Tell me, who do you remember more? Ash or Mordekaiser? Adversary doesn't necessarily mean like bad guy, by the way. A natural disaster can be an adversary, and so can personal strife.
Get clear! Misfire! Misfire! Who packed that charge?
The ones who show up repeatedly and affect a lot of people will always be the most memorable, but not every threat can be Aatrox tier. When I say something that affects a lot of people, I don't literally mean that it has to affect the entire world. A guild whose growth has gotten a little out of control and has started exploiting both local land and its workers is something that affects a lot of people. A den of terrorists who have been engaging in seemingly random attacks might actually have a cohesive ideology when you get to meet them, and maybe they're not entirely wrong. And, of course, the giant imperial empire is a classic for a reason. Note that none of these examples are actually individuals. An enemy doesn't have to be a single person, and in fact, I think it's almost always more interesting if they're an organization rather than just one guy. It gives you more to properly flesh out and makes repeated meetings a lot more natural. Have you ever been experiencing a story, and something happens and you're just like, oh god, how did a committee of people agree on this tropey garbage? I have kind of ended up installing a trope check into my brain whenever I'm doing some writing, and it makes me ask myself constantly, if I was experiencing this story rather than writing it, would I get aggravated by it? You don't have to take your work that seriously, of course, and if you want your band of 6 bountiful adventurers to go out and kill dragons with the power of friendship and magic, then who cares? Go wild. But if you want your stories to actually have some emotional weight, try not to fall into convention. If you're gonna kill a side character for tension, have it be someone people are already intimately familiar with, and not someone you just introduced. I still can't believe people are still making this mistake. It's really not that hard. If you don't have anyone who you think people have grown suitably attached to, then wait. Do something else for a bit, and then go in to twist the knife. I'll miss you, Sev. This video was very different from most of the stuff I put on this channel. Usually, ranty kind of stuff like this is reserved for my second channel. Some stuff came up in my personal life recently, which is why there wasn't a video last week, and I wanted to kind of decompress with something I know a lot about, I think, anyway, and I thought it'd be kind of fun. Thanks to all my patrons. You're all quite wonderful people. Love you all, and good night.
Any questions?
What's the meaning of life, Sergeant?
Fuck you, Gomez.